Good day, everyone. My name is Ebimbori Seifa, and this is West Africa and the World. This is a platform where crucial events occurring across the West African subcontinent in critical sector are being explored. We also look at how global events shapes and influences current socio-economic, political, and security realities in the subcontinent. For today's conversation, we will be discussing the war in Iran and its implication on the West African subcontinent. Before we delve into this very important conversation that will dominate today's conversation, it's very important that I remind you to subscribe to this channel, write down your comments or observation in the comment box, and more importantly, write your recommendations for future conversations. Now we delve into the conversation. In order to properly explore the implication of the war in Iran on West Africa, it is very, very important that we identify the actors and put in context some of the reasons they've given for their involvement in this conflict. We start with the United States of America. The US makes it very clear that its involvement in this conflict is to promote international peace and security, given the example of the enrichment of uranium in Iran and its implication for nuclear weapons proliferation. It also asserts very loudly that it is fighting this war to promote and to protect the democratic rights and values of Iranians who do not want the current administration. It also cites its relationship or security alliance with Israel. And of course, through its different press briefing by its president, talks about the need for regime change in Iran, preferably a government who is interested in having similar foreign and national interests as the United States when it comes to energy security in that part of the world. For Israel, its reasons are very, very clear. For Israel, it's about national security, national interests. It argues that Iran has supported groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, which Israel identified as a threat to its existence. It also argued that Iran should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons because Iran having nuclear weapons is a threat to Israel's national security. And Benjamin Netanyahu's long-standing plans of being the regional hegemon, the most powerful regional hegemon in the Middle East. For Iran, it's quite clear. Iran toes the line of sovereignty and anti-imperialism. Iran argues that it is a sovereign state and should therefore be able to make decisions not being influenced or shaped or coerced by Western powers when it comes to its economic and, more importantly, security decisions. So these are some of the reasons put forward. When we put this reason in context in regards to the West African subcontinent, there are three pertinent issues that we reflect on. The issue of regime change, US unilateral decision to change the regime in Iran. What does this mean for West African countries, West African states whose governments might not be deemed positive or deemed good or deemed democratic by major powers? What does that mean for collective security? What does that mean for alliances as well? A very key aspect also talks about the issue of sovereignty and anti-imperialism. In recent years, we've had a resurgence of military coup in West Africa, and this has led to the development of the Alliance of Sahel States. And amongst the different objectives put forward by these states is the advocacy for anti-imperialism. It argues that countries in the global south should no longer be influenced by the interests of the global north countries or the powerful countries. And Iran has been steadily building up itself as the resistance to anti-imperialism. Critical issue that should be reflected on. And in terms of national security, this goes without saying. Every country in West Africa is interested in protecting their own national interests. And this speaks to the different alliances that are available for us to explore. Do we want to explore or keep our relationship with the GCC countries ongoing? Do we want to maintain our relationship with the global north as well, which seems to be largely in support of what the US is doing currently in Iran as well as Israel? We look at this from that perspective. Now we delve into the different reasons or implications of this conflict in Iran, why it's important that we have this conversation when it comes to West Africa. We look at the aspect of economic security or economic reasons. As we're very much aware, the Strait of Hormuz is very, very important when it comes to shipping of important petroleum products. That trade route is very, very strategic for economic activities in the West African subcontinent. Granted, Nigeria, the largest oil-producing country in West Africa, produces, or rather refines petroleum products, but the percentage doesn't necessarily meet the domestic needs, not just for Nigerians, but also the continent and subcontinent as a whole. And so ever since the Strait of Hormuz has been shut down, it has been difficult for us to have cheap and easy access to this critical petroleum product, which drives economic activities and also links to energy security as well. The cost of fuel, the cost of diesel, the cost of kerosene has gone up. Small, medium enterprises are feeling the brunt of the close down of the Strait of Hormuz. Transportation costs are also quite high as well, translating into high inflation prices of consumer goods and services within the subcontinent. When it comes to energy security, we cannot underestimate the importance of energy on economic activities across the subcontinent. That is one aspect of economic implication. We now move on to food insecurity as well. Now, for several years now, over a decade, the West African subcontinent has been vulnerable to violent extremist groups whose activities are manifested in the rural communities, which serve as the backbone of agricultural activities in the subcontinent. This has heightened food insecurity and increased the prices of cash and food products. The Strait of Hormuz, a very important shipping route, carries not just petroleum products but also fertilizers that are critical for high increase of food and cash crops. The high costs of fertilizer, in addition to high inflation and high cost of energy, has made it very, very difficult for farmers, both small, medium, and large-scale farmers, to break even, leading to high cost of food. These are just a few implications where economic aspect is concerned. We now move on to the next implication, which focus more on the diplomatic aspect of it. Very, very important. In the early days of this conflict, we noticed that during that very important conversation at the United Nations Security Council level, no African state was represented in that conversation. What that meant is that we couldn't weigh on the conversation regarding how this conflict was going to be contained or resolved. Bear in mind that West Africa, as well as East Africa and North Africa, do have serious implication, or rather bear serious vulnerabilities when it comes to this particular conflict. Not being part of that conversation speaks to our position in international world order, but more importantly, our diplomatic strength as well. Still on diplomacy as well. Yes, West Africa might not currently host a numerous actors, their military bases like what we have in the Horn of Africa in terms of Djibouti. And so diplomatic or military implications might not weigh heavily within our subcontinent. But members of West Africa are also members of very important blocs, whose members are crucial actors in this conflict, be it the OIC, be it OPEC, and be it BRICS, although we have Nigeria as an observer state in BRICS. But the point is that West African countries have traditionally adopted a tradition of non-interference or positive neutrality, which means that we don't necessarily always take specific stands, not because we're not interested, as long as whatever diplomatic occurrences are happening or whatever events are happening across the globe do not bear direct consequences to our regional interests, we might not necessarily take a stand. But then again, like I mentioned earlier on, we have many member states in different blocs and different actors with their different interests. We cannot afford to rock the boats. China is interested in West Africa. It is promoting and working steadily on its Belt and Road Initiative. It has invested so much on infrastructure. In addition to that as well, the United States and a number of West African countries have signed that controversial treaty on health. And don't forget Russia's interest in security and its objective of building a strong diplomatic presence in our subcontinent. And of course, we also have not necessarily newcomers, but emerging powers. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, all of them with their different interests in West Africa. That speaks to a stronger West African agency, which should lead to better deals that will strengthen our position in the international community, but more importantly, build up our development and security objectives. And so we can't necessarily take a stand. But then again, we also have what we call divisive politics within the subcontinent. We have the AES states who are currently advocating anti-imperialism, a very, very important part of the conversation that we cannot ignore. But then again, the AES state has been largely silent, not necessarily condemning the conflict going on between Iran, Israel, and the United States. It still goes on to talk about anti-imperialism and makes it very, very clear that nationalism holds forth and West African states or African countries should have sovereignty over critical decisions within their different realities. And so we see this aspect of diplomacy, divisive politics. And we have Nigeria and Ghana not necessarily talking about the conflict or condemning any side, but also quietly reinforcing the need for diplomatic engagement, the need for dialogue, and the need for peaceful resolution. And that brings us to this very, very important diplomatic aspect of multilateralism. When we watch this particular conflict, we see three different framings. We see the Western media emphasizing on international peace and security, emphasizing on nuclear weapons proliferation. We see Middle Eastern media emphasizing on international law, emphasizing on unilateral decisions, emphasizing on human rights protection. And then we see the African media emphasizing more on economic and energy implication. And all these framings are very, very important. We cannot ignore them and also have serious implication for West Africa. When we focus on the aspect of the Western media, when it talks about international peace and security, that is really, really important as well. Because every time there's a conflict in the Middle East or any part of the world, there are always implications for us over here in West Africa, especially when you talk about the issue of limited access to the Strait of Hormuz and what it means for consumer goods and services, and the multiplier effects on domestic households as well as small, medium enterprises. When you reflect on the Middle Eastern view in terms of international law and regime removal, then we begin to think about national security from the West African perspective. What happens when certain governments in West Africa do not fit the mold or are believed to not toe the line of great powers or the current presiding superpowers? Would we be removed like what happened in Venezuela? Would threats be made or invasion be made like what we have seen in Iran? So these are food for thought and serious diplomatic implication. What happens to multilateralism and collective security? These are things to reflect on. When we even reflect on the tactic adopted by Iran by attacking US interests in countries within the Middle East, countries like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, like Qatar, for instance, we begin to reflect and ask ourselves, where is the role for collective security? And what alliances should we have? What geopolitical codes should West African countries calculate? Who should be our allies? Who are potential allies? Who are our enemies? Who are potential enemies as well? What countries should we support and what countries should we not support, and what stance should we take? Granted, the majority voice from West Africa in terms of diplomatic has been largely neutral. We're not necessarily taking sides, but we're still advocating for a peaceful means to resolve this conflict. we still advocate for diplomacy and for mediation. That speaks to that narrative of reinforcing and insisting on multilateralism and collective security as the line to toe by the Western powers or by the great powers. In terms of the economic aspect of it, where African countries are talking about, we've already talked about that earlier in terms of the energy implications. These are things that we cannot overlook, and these are things that we should not ignore when we have this conversation. But then again, we reflect more on that critical aspect of imperialism. And what does it mean for West African states? Yes, the dominant conversation within the West African media might be on the economic implications of this war. But within academic discourse and within the streets of West Africa, we begin to see this divisive politics, first of all, reflect at the regional level, where we have the AES states reinforcing or talking about or speaking against anti-imperialism, where this nationalist ideas has led to the exit of the US and the EU and France from these three countries. And then we see Nigeria and Ghana towing the line of multilateralism, seemingly being on the side of Western powers, not because it actually wants to support what the United States and Israel and Iran are currently doing in Iran and neighboring countries, but because it has to think carefully about the different alliances that it has cultivated, as well as treaties it has signed. Treaties that carries a lot of sanctions, that carries a lot of monetary implications as well. So this is a very, very tight trope for West African countries to follow. But in addition to that as well, West African countries are also aware that Iran is not the only option it has when it comes to alliances with GCC countries. Saudi Arabia is there, Kuwait is there, Qatar is there as well. So it has multiple options and can leverage on existing treaties. Good and very important food of thought. But it does not take away the fact that regime change is very, very important and a serious concern for the subcontinent, and one that we should reflect on. So we have highlighted and raised a lot of questions and issues, and also connected a few of these dots in terms of implication. But we cannot close this conversation without reflecting on areas of intervention. In the last 10 years or so, we have had different conflicts happening across the subcontinent. We have the Russian-Ukraine war, which would have been an opportunity for West African states, in particular Nigeria, to leverage on its oil and gas sector by supplying gas and crude oil to countries in Europe. We also had the Suez Canal and the Red Sea conflict last year, as well as this current conflict with the Strait of Hormuz being closed, and what it means for infrastructure, supply chains, and shipping routes. These are things that West African states has to start reflecting on and looking at how we can always leverage on existing relationship and build on critical infrastructure. The implications are real. The issue of unilateral decisions is real as well. The issue of regime change cannot be ignored, and the issue of collective security. Yes, there is a stronger room for West African agency. We have multiple treaties signed by multiple actors, each of them with multiple interests driving the conflict in Iran, or choosing to abstain from resolving or issuing any critical statement regarding the conflict in Iran. But West African leaders do have a responsibility to do what is best for the West African region. And before I forget, another critical issue that we cannot ignore is the regional security issue. West Africa is home to over 25 active non-state armed actors, Boko Haram being one of the most deadliest of them all. Boko Haram has a tradition of tweaking its ideology or aligning with any group it believes will support it financially tactically, intelligence-wise, or training. It has been known to swear allegiance to the Taliban in Afghanistan. It has been known to support and become a part of the franchise group of Al-Qaeda. It has also been known to also support the ideology of ISIS in promoting its view. So what stopped Iran from attacking Western interests in West Africa if it so chooses to do so? We have seen it do that as a tactic in Kuwait, in Qatar, in UAE, in Saudi Arabia. That might not be an immediate threat. We have the Shia Islamic movement of Nigeria, which during the early days of this conflict had pockets of protest across the northern part of Nigeria. But this particular movement has been largely decapitated by the Nigerian military and the Nigerian government. But what if Iran decides to extend an arm of support to any of these groups? What does that mean for regional security in West Africa? These are critical implications that we cannot ignore and we need to reflect on. But definitely, from what we have read in our newspaper headlines and what we hear from the streets of West Africa, the prevailing implication is the economic and energy implication, which cannot be ignored. So, our intervention has to reinforce the issue of regional security, but more importantly, collective security, either at the West African level or at the international level. Reflect more on our supply chains, and of course, build our infrastructure. Thank you very much for listening to my thoughts on the impact of the conflict in West Africa, impact of the conflict in Iran on West Africa. Do not forget to subscribe, drop your comments, and of course, write out your recommendation for future discussions. My name is Boris Seifa, and this is West Africa and the World.